45 years ago, an overweight child was a rarity, less than 1 in 100. Today, 30% of South African girls are overweight or obese. More than half of South African adults are also overweight. How have we changed so drastically in a relatively short period of time? Medical science now recognizes obesity as a disease condition, one that leads to many other diseases such as cancer, heart disease, diabetes and joint disease. Today is World Obesity Day. We look into this condition and also how to break the cycle of shame and blame. We speak to Gabriel Eksteen. He is a dietitian and exercise physiologist from the Heart and Stroke Foundation, South Africa, and he joins us now live from our studios in Sea Point. Good afternoon to you, Gabriel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the show.
All right, so firstly, really, let's just look at the prevalence of obesity in South Africa, perhaps comparing us to other countries.
Yes, South Africa is by far the worst afflicted in sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, you know, internationally there's a few other countries that probably top us, but in South Africa, about 21% of women are overweight, and on top of that, another 41% of women are what we call obese, which is the extreme form of extra body fatness. And then in men, we're sitting at about 11% of men being in the obese category. And what we also know from the figures released today from the World Obesity Day is that this will only continue to increase. So we're seeing that, for instance, in men, figures will jump from about 11% to 23% by 2025 compared to 2016. So in totality, we see that more than half of adults in South Africa are either overweight or obese.
But what's the problem really here when it comes to obesity? Because there's that overall perception that obesity is as a result of perhaps eating too much or eating unhealthy or doing less and laziness. But the reality is, just like any other chronic disease, the root cause of obesity runs a bit deeper.
Yes, exactly. You hit the nail on the head, and that's exactly the theme of this World Obesity Day, is the roots of obesity run deep. And what we're trying to say or highlight by that is obesity is not only the fault of the individual, which is the common perception we have, is someone eats too much, doesn't exercise, they're lazy, and because of that they become overweight. So what we are trying to say is that the disease is far more complicated. It is, as you mentioned, a disease, which means it's not a personal choice. It's something that happens to us, and we are in a sense victims to our environment, because one of the biggest factors that has changed over the last couple of decades is the environment we live in. The foods we have every day around us, how active we are in our environment, our social cultural environment, our perceptions around weight status, all these things feed into our risk of becoming overweight. We refer to this as our obesogenic environment, which in essence means our environment is making us overweight, and it's far too easy to become overweight and too hard not to become overweight. And that's why we're seeing these spiraling obesity figures, not only in South Africa but worldwide. But specifically in South Africa, we have a unique set of circumstances that increases our risk.
Yeah, so you talk about environmental factors, but we also have those biological factors that also promote obesity. For instance, poor nutrition. When you are a child, even as an unborn baby, is likely to make you overweight at a later stage. And a lot of people would not even know this. So the discussion that we're having now, it actually points to a lack of information that we have as the country, perhaps.
Yes, definitely. I think what you mentioned there is very important. Is, you know, not even everything is within our own control. We can't control all these factors. If you were underweight as a child, your upbringing as a child, whether your parents were overweight, all these things feed into our risk of becoming overweight. So we can't just, again, blame the individual for that. But I think also what is important for the individual is once you start understanding that you are not in complete control, it can also be quite empowering to understand that this is not just your choice, but something that you can start doing something about by seeking better solutions. But then equally, the solutions is not only up to the individual. We need to work as a society towards larger solutions, which points to policymakers, which points to industry and us as a society, and how we are accountable for how we live.
So I'm looking at the numbers now, Gabriel, that some countries have set a target to halt the rise in obesity, some of them aiming for a 0% increase between 2010 and 2025. Our probability here in South Africa of meeting this global target is less than a percentage, as you said. So how do we go about preventing obesity and perhaps treatment in terms of prioritizing that particular treatment?
Yes, I think you mentioned two very important things there. There's two parts of the solution. The one is prevention and the one is treatment. And for prevention, we need an overall systems change. And that's one of the things we are calling for on World Obesity Day is all the worldwide partners that are combining on this day to send out this message are putting together a declaration of basically 5 kind of key strategies or key focus areas where we need to look at, that policymakers need to look at specifically, so we can start kind of beating this epidemic and really making a significant change to it. So that's very important. But I think in South Africa we have some very kind of broad, good plans set out for obesity prevention. We just need to make sure that those plans are being implemented. We've seen already positive things like sugar tax happening, but we still need to see a lot more happening about the types of foods that are available, how those foods are marketed, where they're available, and also our ability to exercise, whether we can have safe, accessible spaces, things like that. But then equally important is making holistic weight loss services available for people. So we're not talking about going in to see a dietitian or a nurse or a doctor once to try and tell you that you're overweight and you need to change. We're actually talking about really supporting people ongoingly with holistic therapy, looking at how you eat, how you exercise, as well as the behavioral components behind that. And unless we intervene with those kind of holistic solutions, we're not going to see that people lose weight successfully.
All right, time constraints, we have to leave it at this, but thank you so much for talking to us here on the SABC News channel. That's Gabriel Eksteen. He is a dietitian and also an exercise physiologist, talking to us about today being a World Obesity Day. And of course, as he has mentioned the numbers, things are not looking good for us here as South Africa. As I said, that a number of countries have actually set themselves some targets of halting the rise in obesity to 0% between 2010 and 2025, but the probability here at home, it's just at 1%. So clearly something has to be done, and very quick.